Shin is a good-for-nothing pathetic loser who gets stuck inside a game. With no regard for his family, Shin decides to start a new life inside the game as he comes across his old comrade and meets some new people as well. The New Gate is the most advanced MMORPG created using state-of-the-art technology. Players can roam around freely in this world with their favorite characters, defeat powerful monsters, and even make a huge fortune using trading. However, one day, this exciting MMORPG turns into a death game as the players get trapped inside it as they cannot log out, and death inside the game means death in the real world as well. Realizing that the other players are just as useless as Sakura, a wannabe Kirito named Shin steps up and decides to clear the game on his own. He eventually confronts the final boss, and following an intense battle, Shin manages to defeat it. He acquires some crazy titles including the Transcended, the Accomplished, and the Liberator. With this, the players can now log out and leave the game. Before leaving himself, Shin decides to wait till all the other players leave. After all the other players leave, Shin attempts to log out as well, as suddenly, a mysterious light appears out of nowhere, and Shin gets unconscious. Upon waking up, he realizes that he is still inside the game, and for some reason, it feels way too realistic. He also notices that his stats have boosted a lot, which makes sense since he defeated the last boss. He then attempts to log out once again, only to notice that the logout option is gone. This makes him realize that even without the truck-kun, he is trapped inside the game, and with no other option left, he decides to venture back to his home in the game. On his way, he comes across a massive town which shocks him. As soon as he reaches home, he witnesses some random losers threatening an elf to reveal the location of her master. The elf ignores them, just like my crush ignores me, but the thugs force her outside the barrier. As soon as they get outside the barrier, a random monster attacks them and the thugs piss their pants. Being a Sigma male, Shin appears out of nowhere and saves her sorry. The elf then takes him to the Moon Sanctum and introduces herself as Tiara. She questions if he's an acquaintance of her master, as Shin inquires the identity of her master while glaring at her massive melons. Tiara reveals that her master is Schnee Razor, as Shin remembers that Schnee was one of the random NPCs he didn't give a shit about. Hearing all this, Shin wants to meet Schnee, but Tiara refuses, stating that she cannot allow a random nobody to meet her master. Following all this, Shin gets some important information regarding this world as Tiara tells him that Shin's race, High Humans, went extinct around 500 years ago during the sunset on Prosperity. Shin immediately realizes that this sunset whatever must be when he defeats the final boss. In return for his information, Shin grants her a golden gale while ogling at her melons. He also addresses her as a beautiful elf, which shocks her because she knows she's ugly as f***. She further reveals that an elf with black hair is a cursed sign of ill fortune. She further tells him that her black hair brings forth disaster and attracts monsters, and are the reason she was exiled from her village. Schnee was the one who saved her and cast this barrier around the shop. Within this barrier, Tiara is completely safe, and Schnee even altered her appearance using illusion magic, so people won't despise her. Hearing all this, Shin remembers something and utilizes the skill Analyze to appraise this curse. It is revealed that this curse is actually named the Cursed Gift, and he can even remove this curse. With this, he purifies Tiara off this curse, and some of her hair returns back to being silver. This makes her insanely happy, but she is still not sure if she can venture outside. Shin then forcefully takes her outside and reassures her that he'll defeat any monsters coming their way. He then takes her to a mountain where Tiara starts crying, stating that she had forgotten how vast the sky actually is. At this point, my man Shin has successfully managed to rizz up an elf. After this, they return back as Tiara questions Shin about his future activities. He reveals that he plans to travel around different towns. He wants to know more about this world and wonders if other support characters are also alive. Hearing this, Tiara grants him a letter of introduction that would allow him to pass any town checkpoint without any trouble. With this, Shin reaches the nearby town, where a random NPC escorts him to the guild. On their way, the guard reveals that Shin can even get an audience with the king using this letter, even though Shin didn't ask him. Upon reaching the guild, Shin registers himself as an adventurer, but it'll take at least a day until the guild card is finished. Just then, a woman named Celica serves him food and starts staring towards him as Shin eats. This makes him uncomfortable, and he questions the reason behind her awkward gaze. Celica tells him that they want to confirm the authenticity of his letter in another room where Shin meets the Guildmaster Barlux. The Guildmaster confirms the identity of Shin's letter, using his own letter as both of them start glowing when placed next to each other. He further informs him about the perks of this fascinating letter, which makes Shin realize that Schnee must have gotten insanely popular. The following morning, Shin gets his guild card, and he also takes up a job regarding some hilkweed collection. During this job, Shin accidentally comes across a monster named Skullface Jack. To test his strength, he decides to take on the monster. During their battle, he notices that the undead is wielding a holy sword, which is quite weird. Despite this, Shin manages to beat the monster rather easily as he unleashes his true potential. The holy sword gets lost in the process and somehow ends up in the royal castle. With this, Shin now knows the extent of his power in this new world and is quite excited about it. The knights are quite concerned about the sword that made its way into the castle, as the princess instructs them to determine its composition. They are sure that the one who hurled the sword this far is overwhelmingly strong. Meanwhile, Shin notices some people gathered around injured knights in the town. He questions a random NPC about them as he reveals that they were ambushed by the Skullface, and only 4 of them survived. He further tells him about a sword that made its way into the castle and asks if Shin knows something about it. My man Shin doesn't give a shit about this and plays dumb and decides to report everything to the guild. This shocks Celica as she further questions him regarding this. Just then, another woman appears at the spot only to be surprised by Shin's endeavors. Shin even comments that the Skullface's equipment wasn't that special, so he didn't loot it. With no other option left, they decide to appraise the gem brought by Shin. During their conversation, Shin further reveals that the Skullface Jack's level was around 300, and was probably a unique specimen. Hearing this, Celica hurries to get the crystal appraised to determine the monster's level and confirm Shin's statement. According to them, if Shin has managed to defeat a level 359 Skullface Jack, then he's probably stronger than a useless A-rank party. Following all this, Shin decides to have lunch and urges them to keep his strength a secret. At the restaurant, the waitress asks Shin if he would mind sharing a table with someone, to which he replies negatively. Just then, a weird guy appears at the restaurant and sits beside Shin. Shin immediately recognizes his weapon as the mystical spear, Venom, which is recognized as a legendary weapon. After Shin introduces himself, the guy also introduces himself as Wilhelm Avis, who questions if Shin is a rookie adventurer. After Shin tells him that he started 3 days ago, the guy gets shocked and comments on his equipment, stating that it is better than the lot. Wilhelm then tells him that people fear him because he is always hunting undead. Shin, however, is completely unbothered by his presence and even calls him dumb. Wilhelm further reveals the ability of his spear as Drain. According to him, this ability drains the life force of his enemies and transfers it to him. The following day, Shin decides to research the history of this world and reaches a library for the first time in his entire life. He comes across some information regarding the vanishing incident and deduces that it must be owing to all the players logging out simultaneously. Meanwhile, the leader of the guild is having a meeting with some knights from the castle. The guild has confirmed that the Skullface Jack was indeed level 359, which makes him king class. They are also shocked at the fact that Shin left the equipment behind. The castle wants to learn more about the guy who defeated the monster, but the guild refuses to reveal Shin's identity. The knights believe that the random sword flying into the castle is somehow related to Shin defeating the Skullface Jack. With all of this going on, Shin realizes that gathering information is quite tough as he notices a girl staring towards him. Realizing that she must be hungry, he offers her some food, which she readily accepts. The girl introduces herself as Millie and deems Shin a good person. Just then, Wilhelm appears at the spot, and the girl immediately recognizes him. This makes Shin wonder if they're related. Wilhelm clears the misunderstanding by stating that Millie is an orphan and is an expert at running away, so he's always looking out for her. Before they head back, Millie asks Shin to save some fox in the northern forest, which shocks him. With no other option left, he decides to check out the forest. The following day, he heads towards the Moon Sanctum, where he meets Tiara and hands over some magic items she can use to communicate with him whenever Shni returns. The reason he cannot use it to communicate with Shni directly is because they are not acquaintances in this world. He also hands over a sword named the Blue Moon that only Shni and Shin himself can wield. Following this, Shin heads into the forest and notices a barrier telling him to get the hell out of this forest. Despite this, he ventures further into the forest and comes across a shrine. As soon as he enters the shrine, he hears something crack, but avoids it and heads inside, where he comes across a fox. Realizing that the fox is poisoned and cursed, he utilizes his abilities to heal it. Suddenly, he notices some monsters approaching him and realizes that the cracking sound must be the barrier tearing apart. Much to his surprise, hundreds of undeads are gathered outside the shrine, and with no other option left, Shin beats the living out of them. Just when he thinks that everything is over, the fox statues guarding the shrine turn into monsters and ambush him. He attempts to subjugate them using Shadow Bing, but the monsters free themselves by surrounding the entire area with black smoke and hindering Shin's vision. Now that he cannot visualize them, the monsters take full advantage of this and keep attacking Shin. The fox, however, guides Shin towards a magic circle that allows him to see the monsters despite all this smoke. Seizing the opportunity, Shin absolutely folds the monsters and ends it all. With all of this over now, Shin appraises the fox and realizes that it is actually an elemental, the highest tier monster in the new gate. The fox has also taken a liking to Shin, who wants to meet Millie again. Meanwhile, Shni receives a message from Tiara telling her about Shin and is quite excited about meeting him. Watch this next video, and thank you, my fellow otakus.